Okay, well, welcome everybody to another Primary Innovation webinar. It's James Turner from AgriSearch here. I'm stepping into John James's shoes again to run the webinar, so it's a great experience for me. And I'd really like to thank Sam Beechener from Scotland, from SRUC in Scotland, for very kindly putting together and being willing to stay up into the early hours in Scotland of 1 o'clock to share with us what he's been doing and learning from his PhD research that he's been doing as part of Primary Innovation, where he's been looking at how co-innovation can enable scaling up and scaling out, so spreading innovation from one location to another and beyond, and also starting to make changes in other organisations outside those of the farm and elsewhere to help with that geographical spread. But I'm sure Sam will give a much more and better explanation of scaling up and scaling out. So thank you very much, Sam, for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now to run your webinar. Thanks a lot.
James, thanks very much for the introduction. I should probably start by confessing I didn't really check the time differences when I said yes to Akiko's invitation, so it's my fault for staying up till 1 o'clock in the morning, but I'm delighted to have this opportunity to bring people up to date with the findings so far, so I'll make a start on that. So first and foremost, I'd really like to acknowledge the support of my supervisors. That's Lawrence over in Wageningen, Niels with you in New Zealand, and Anne, Andrew and Chrissa here in the UK. And it's feel very privileged to have the support of such a strong group of supervisors. It's very much a journey of discovery, this PhD for me. When we set out, I think the intention was, or the expectation was, it would be exploring how co-innovation impacts on scaling. But what I want to demonstrate in the presentation is how we've sort of evolved our thinking, and it's become much more a case of exploring how co-innovation anticipates scaling rather than impacts. And I'll explain the reasons for that in the slides that follow. We're having a break after about 10 minutes for questions and answer and discussion. So I'd really welcome feedback and thoughts at that stage. And then again, at the end of the presentation, another pause for reflection and discussion as well at that stage. So I would really welcome comments, feedback and questions at those points in the presentation. So in terms of the aims of the work, as I said, it's all about better understanding how co-innovation contributes to scaling, and that's sort of to early scaling and anticipation of future scaling activities. So as I said at the start, we expect to be exploring how co-innovation impacts on scaling, but as I'm trying to demonstrate in the chart on the slide in front of you there, scaling is sort of very unfolds over an extended time period. So a sort of piece of work from the World Bank looking at development of innovations in a healthcare context, and you can see they're attaching a time frame to that, which sort of gives us some indication of the times involved. So they're talking about 10+ years to move from an early innovation through to what they describe as promising practice. On top of that, another 3 to 5 years for the model to become better established and to provide evidence across a wide handful of cases. And it's not until you get to 5 to 10 years after that that you start getting into the realms of good and best practice and ultimately potentially policy principle. So we can see that these sort of processes unfold over an extended period of time. So within the time frame of a sort of a 3 to 4 year PhD, it's limited in terms of the impacts that we're likely to observe. So it's much more a case of investigating early scaling activities and trying to anticipate future scaling impacts. And that's really where we've prioritized our efforts. And you'll see as the presentation develops, the theories that we're drawing on to try and give us some sort of direction with those investigations. So the rationale and approach behind the work, the objectives are very much about studying the social and technical interactions to do with the in-field application of co-innovation in New Zealand around the Primary Innovation Project. And our research questions have developed really to sort of explore what practitioners understand by co-innovation, how that understanding then develops over time and is operationalized in the field, and how applying that approach to co-innovation then influences and anticipates scaling processes. And as I say, we're looking for evidence of early impacts, anticipation of future scaling, and we're particularly keen to try and explore where there might be leverage by co-innovation over the scaling processes. And that's really what I want to try and draw out during the presentation today. The approach that we adopted was a case study approach. That seemed the most applicable means really of investigating what are fairly complex interactions and activities amongst a diverse range of practitioners. And the contribution that we're hoping to make is very much around adding new knowledge to that which already exists around the impacts or the effects of co-innovation, which have really sort of to date been concentrating on early stages of development, and we're trying to push that out to look at these later scaling stages of activity. So that's very much the contribution that we're keen to make to the discussion. In terms of the outline for today's presentation, what I wanted to do was to provide a broad brush outline of the background of the project in terms of global and local drivers of change, and then to think how that informs an agricultural innovation systems perspective, which we're drawing on to inform the project, and then to spend a little bit more time outlining what's called the scaling pathway and what that involves and the implications of that. At that point, there's a short 5-minute break for discussion, questions and answers. As I said, really welcome comments and feedback at that stage. And then after the break, I want to think a little bit more about operationalising co-innovation, what that means in practice, and then to introduce something called the theory of anchoring, which is an approach which we're adopting to try and provide some structure for the investigations that we're conducting. And then to draw things to a close by thinking about the next steps and to invite closing discussion and any sort of outstanding questions and answers for the last 5 minutes of the presentation. So in terms of background, what I'd like to outline is sort of these complex, sometimes competing pressures that face the agri-food systems around the world. So I'm sure you'll be very well aware about sort of the population increase forecast and the implications of that for agri-food production. And it's not just about feeding a growing number of people, it's also about addressing those inequalities between those that have more than enough to eat and those that have not enough or insufficient amounts to eat. So it's a whole bundle of things in there within this sort of population increases. At the same time, of course, you've got intense pressure on natural resources. We've got a drive here in the UK to produce more from less, and that's very often termed or couched in terms of sustainable intensification. And it's sort of in recognition that sort of natural resources are both dwindling to some extent and also under pressure in terms of their sort of maintaining their quality in other spheres. There are complex interactions, of course, between farming and climate change, both the impacts of farming on the climate and the impacts of a changing climate on farming activities that need to be taken into account. And overarching all of that, we've got these tensions which have been described or visualized in terms of the agro-industrial and the sort of competing agroecological paradigms. And those of you that are familiar with these terms will be aware that sort of the agro-industrial traces its sort of origins back to the post-war period, when there was very much a drive to increase productivity and to feed what was very much a hungry world at that time, or almost at any cost. So productivity was very much key. And it's more latterly really that sort of the ecological aspects have come to a greater prominence, if you like, in terms of sort of challenging that prevailing agro-industrial paradigm. And on the slides, or in the slides that follow, we'll see those sort of themes of tension and competing paradigms are ones that we come back to at different points during the presentation. Of course, it's not just global drivers. I want to ground it as well in sort of the local drivers of change. Here in the UK, the focus is very much on Brexit at the moment, understandably, and it probably depends on your perspective whether you are a Remainer or a Leaver, whether you see Brexit representing a potential challenge or perhaps more of an opportunity for the agri-food sector. But I think one area where those two groups would find common ground is that there's going to be a period of considerable uncertainty for the agri-food sector as those changes come into effect. We were lucky enough to have a seminar by Professor Eric Milston from Sussex University here in Edinburgh, and he outlined for us very clearly the sort of the implications, and he described the intensive lobbying activity going on by the food retailers at a government level, really bringing home the point that sort of any change to free trade agreements or free movement of goods between the UK and southern European producers will feed through to food price increases on the shop shelves and potential shortages of goods as well. So some very stark warnings for government there in terms of potential food price inflation or food availability. At the same time, the economists are raising issues for consideration around free trade. So we've got the attraction of potential free trade agreements with third parties, but they're reminding us at the same time that that comes with consequences in terms of opening up the domestic market for those external trading partners. And in the US context, for example, they're thinking in terms of BST milk production, hormone reared beef and chlorine treated chicken, for instance, just to highlight one or two examples. And then the farmers' representative groups themselves are lobbying government very hard, trying to get some clarity about what the changes might mean from the sort of the existing support mechanisms to how they might look further down the line. So we've got some certainty up until the early 2020s. Government are guaranteeing no change up until that point. But beyond that, farmers are asking, what does the landscape look like? And for long-term planning activities like agriculture, that 2020 is not that far away, of course. And it's interesting because this doesn't take very long for any discussion around the implications or the possible implications of Brexit in a UK context for people to start citing New Zealand and using that as an example of a thriving agri-food sector standing on its own feet, working without subsidies, for example, and commentators point to the withdrawal of subsidies from New Zealand agriculture in the 1980s and cite today's resilient, productive, go-ahead agri-food sector. Some commentators trace those origins of those changes back a little bit further, and they talk about the shockwaves which accompanied the UK's entry to the European Union back in the 1970s as sort of precipitating those changes in agriculture in New Zealand. But it's interesting, we sort of tend to hear very much about a resilient and an innovative agri-food sector in New Zealand, and it's only occasionally that the debate goes much beyond that and people start exploring what the consequences of those changes might have been. And indeed, there was a series on the BBC's Farming Today programme just recently when one of their reporters spent time on the ground in New Zealand speaking to producers and stakeholders within the industry and trying to understand a little bit more about the sort of the impacts of those changes, the hardship for producers, and the consequences for some of the natural environment or the agri-environment measures which are only now coming through to be recognised. And of course, at the moment, there's this dual challenge of responding to those consequences and at the same time delivering growth in terms of increasing export earnings from the agri-food sector. So what is interesting between the United Kingdom and New Zealand is that innovation is seen very much as a vital component in mobilising an effective response to the challenges that the two countries face in very different ways. So in the UK, we're talking at an agri-tech strategy, for instance, and you've got your own examples in New Zealand, primary innovation and subsequent projects to that, looking at sort of exploring innovation in the context of the agri-food sector. So what I've tried to describe is an agri-food sector that's facing some significant challenges at both a global and a more localised level. But there's a characteristic, of course, of agriculture, which is the large number of small producers, which really sets it apart from other sectors of the economy. And we're thinking in terms there of the place specificities of climate, soil, and so on. But the point that I wanted to make was that sort of where there's a local global disconnect, we have the risk of so-called knowledge gaps occurring. And it's very much trying to address these potential knowledge gaps that I think we can see the emergence of more collaborative innovation systems thinking over time. So as I'm showing on the slide in front of you now, we're sort of looking at the evolution from technology transfer in the 1960s through to the sort of agricultural innovation systems thinking, which we're more familiar with in the 2000s. And over that time frame, we can cast our minds back and think about the sort of the agro-industrial paradigm, which we talked about on one of the earlier slides, and how that very much dominated the situation in the 1960s. It was that push for production. It was that belief in science providing all the answers, and very much sort of a top-down approach in terms of its implementation. And it's with the emergence of the sort of agri-environment or competing paradigms that we've started to take a much broader or a systemic perspective of these changes to try and take into account the wider changes. And I think, as Anik put it very nicely in her webinar just the other week, we're sort of recognizing that innovation is very much the process or the product of interactions between a wide number of players and stakeholders. So I want to start introducing scaling, and before I do that, I want to just outline some of the considerations to bear in mind when we're thinking about scaling and what that means. So Lovell et al. Very usefully, I think, draw out a number of considerations, and against each of those they identify a number of risks if we're not sufficiently mindful to them, as well as potential remedial measures. I don't want to go through all of these. I've just highlighted one or two, which I think start to take us into the territory of co-innovation. And this is what I'm trying to do, trying to sort of understand links between scaling and where co-innovation might have some leverage over those scaling processes. So we'll just sort of look at the highlighted in red examples here. So we've got the emphasis on impacts needing to be investigated at multiple scales, so that's at a broader as well as a finer scale, to make sure that we don't risk losing that wider perception and the sort of a single scale dominating things at the expense of other levels of aggregation. Recognition that processes, especially natural processes, will unfold over different and often very extended time frames. So it's that importance of the importance attached here to being mindful of those processes and those accompanying time frames that differ between them. We've got spatial differences as well in terms of scale, and an emphasis on exploring cross-scale interactions wherever possible, and that's something that we'll come back to on the slides that follow. And also in terms of an institutional context, and by that we're thinking about the rules of the game, for example, where it's important to understand where overlaps or gaps exist, and crucially where the balance of decision-making powers lie. And it's interesting, in discussion with a veterinary surgeon just within the last couple of weeks on another project, and they were articulating very clearly how delicate that balance of power can be to negotiate with nutritionists and with producers and with building designers, for example, in the example that they were sharing with me on that occasion. And it's about understanding how relationships between individual decision makers and the wider community function. So we can start to see lots of emphasis within these scaling considerations on aspects of sort of different levels of aggregation, different time frames, cross-scale interactions, and balance of power and sort of community involvement. So as I say, starting to get us towards the sort of co-innovation territory. So when we start trying to attach a definition to scaling and what we mean by that, Wesley et al. Talk about moving into the mainstream, and that nicely sort of captures the fluidity of the process. So it's the sort of the changing dynamics of the innovation itself, and also the sort of changing destination market or target market, if you like, of course, is continuously evolving at the same time. So we've very much got change going on, different rates of change, but within the innovation and within the sort of the target market or target users. And they go on to make the point that there's sort of dynamics at the micro level between individuals and groups, at a meso level in terms of the problem domain itself, and at the wider macro level, thinking about the prevailing institutions that so influence the direction of things. But when we talk about scaling, it's sort of sometimes you see it described in terms of upscaling or scaling up, or outscaling or broad scaling and deep scaling, and all of those are different ways of cutting the cake, if you like. But the definitions that I'm working with are outscaling, where we understand that to refer to increased take-up among a target group or community, and upscaling, where that refers to seeking institutional endorsement or reforms as part of efforts to create that necessary enabling conditions of change. So we're thinking really in terms of outscaling and upscaling as being the primary drivers of scaling activities. And all of that unfolds along what's sometimes referred to as a scaling pathway. And of course, that sort of negotiated process, there are positive and negative impacts, and it's not a neutral activity. And I want to highlight as well this sort of notion about learning by scaling as sort of underpinning the process. So we're really getting the impression it's not until you sort of roll your sleeves up and start the scaling process that you really start learning what the dynamics are and how the innovation is interacting with that wider environment that's going to be so important to the process. I want to think about scalability as well. So we're sort of thinking about the sort of the criteria that help us to understand the scalability of an innovation, for instance. So here we can see Holcomb talking about clarity and credibility, the legitimacy of the implementing organisation, looking for the monitoring and evaluation to demonstrate the effectiveness of the innovation and its efficiency and use. We've got aspects of financial sustainability, and we've got engagement with stakeholders, and coming back again to this notion of the balance of power. So what Holcomb is suggesting here is that for each of these scalability criteria, there will be factors that perhaps potentially simplify or potentially complicate the situation. So as a simple checklist, you can imagine that sort of if you're identifying simplifying factors for each of those criteria, that's giving you a certain message. If you're sort of at the other end of the spectrum and the factors are more complicating, then that's informing you accordingly. And there are a number of these sort of matrices, people applying this sort of notion of simplifying or complicating factors, or perhaps a SWOT analysis to try and understand, you know, the makeup of the article or the artifact that's sort of being potentially scaled. And again, we can start to see some overlap with sort of the language of co-innovation in terms of planning and understanding, commitment to monitoring and evaluation, talking about sustainability of the approach, and engagement with stakeholders. Wesley talks about 5 shaping elements which have an influence on scaling up in particular, and talking here about the approach to change, what the goals are, the availability or the presence of a shared vision for change, and how that fits or meshes with prevailing institutions. They're talking about the strengths or the advantages of the proposed strategy, and conversely, the challenges or the barriers associated with that. They're coming back to the idea of the pathway for scaling up and the opportunities that have been identified in moving from scaling out to scaling up. The point that I'd like to make there is that from the work that they've done, Wesley et al., talk about the sort of the challenge of scaling out and the number of instances where that has been the approach, and it's got so far before people have come up against institutional barriers and have had to change course in recognition that scaling up activities are necessary to try and tackle those underlying institutional barriers. So it's very much sort of a case of horses for horses, but horses for courses, whichever way around that goes. But we're thinking sort of that, you know, scaling up is very much an integral part of the activity. And associated with all of that, the sort of the barriers and the challenges accompanying the strategy and the risk that goes with that. So just to finish this sort of overview of scaling activities, I wanted to draw on some work by Hermans et al. From 2016, which identifies 3 core dimensions of scaling. So those are in terms of spreading and diffusion, politics and power, and adaptation and transformation. And for each of those dimensions, they're identifying a number of particular measures. So if we take those in turn, we've got for spreading and diffusion, thinking in terms of spatial measures of change, and that can be from the local to the global, for example. We've also got network changes from a small local network, for instance, to a larger network in terms of the number of network participants. And you can imagine how the work that we saw recently from Barbara might inform that sort of understanding in terms of sort of the development and evolution of networks over time. For the second dimension, politics and power, we've got administrative criteria, and that's sort of scaled from regional through to national. And we've got some measure of institutional activities as well, from the informal institutions through to the much more formal institutional structure. And for the third of the dimensions, adaptation and transformation, we're thinking in terms of the innovation itself and its progression from early innovation through, for example, to policy principle, using that sort of criteria that we saw in one of the earlier slides. And by way of shorthand, we can just sort of think about these dimensions in terms of network dimensions, institutional dimensions, and technological dimensions. And those are things that we'll come back to in some of the slides that follow. So that's just by way of introduction to things. So I'm very happy to take any comments or questions at this stage, or just to have sort of broader discussion before we move on to the second part of the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Sam. I've got a few questions through that will help people thinking about how you've framed scaling, and then might be great to push through in terms of what you've been finding from your research, because I know a lot of people will be interested in that, and leave some more questions for later. So a couple of questions at this stage. Is there a difference between scaling issues one finds in technology transfer versus a co-innovation approach?
Well, that's an interesting question, I think, James. And I think I think our understanding of the dynamics of scaling have developed. So it's so I think there's still a place for technology transfer, and that's something that we've discussed as part of the fieldwork in New Zealand. So it's trying to get the appropriate fit. But I think the point I'd probably make is that sort of the comment from Wesley et al.'s observations, and sort of the work they've done with different scaling activities, is where people or where groups have taken a scaling out initiative, and they've got so far before they've come up against institutional barriers, and they've been forced to take a step back and adopt a more proactive scaling up approach to try and address those institutional barriers and create conditions that are more conducive to the change that they're trying to deliver. So I think that would be my understanding, that it's sort of, yes, it gets you so far, but in tackling some of these more complex changes, and I think you're going to come up against those institutional barriers which really demand a more scaling up approach.
Cool. Then there's another question here, another nice sort of one unpacking the difference between scaling and tech transfer. In this case, it's from Ina. Is there a difference between scaling and adoption?
Well, that's Ina. I think that's a good question, and I think that's sort of I think one of the challenges that we've been grappling with is sort of scaling and co-innovation, and I think to an extent as well agricultural innovation systems as a perspective, that all have very sort of broad vocabularies, I think, associated with them. And on the one hand, you can say that really contributes to the richness of the discussion that you're able to have, but it also acts as something of a complicating factor, because using different language, so we try to indicate how sort of scaling and scaling out and upscaling, have a number of different descriptions attached to them. So it can be quite difficult to sort of draw meaningful comparisons and arrive at conclusions between different projects when the language being used can be very different, and you're not always sure that you're comparing apples with apples, and sometimes it's sort of apples with pears, if that makes sense at all. So I think it's interesting sort of the language that we're seeing, and around scaling activities and co-innovation activities as well, I think.
Okay, thanks, Sam. There's another question here as well. I'll leave that to the closing discussion so that you can get through the next set of slides you've got in the time that we've got. So I'll hand it back to you, Sam, to continue on.
Will do. Thanks, James, and thanks for those questions. I thought they were really helpful and sort of fried food for thought. So I wanted to think now about co-innovation and how I'm understanding that. So I think it's useful to think of it in terms of this triple co, in terms of coordination, collaboration, and complementarity. So where those three components are coming together in the form of an innovation platform, for example, and then the output of that being innovation-driven value creation. So that's really what it's all about sort of driving value through the value chain. And so those components we can think about in a little bit more detail. So we've got in terms of collaboration, we're thinking in terms of knowledge and skills and learnings and resources being shared over time between what is a diverse and a potentially evolving group of stakeholders. I think that's a challenge that came through from the fieldwork in New Zealand, how to cope with that evolution of the stakeholders. So, how can you move stakeholders on, keeping them engaged as and when necessary, and it's not always easy for the sort of those that may be feeling left behind to recognise that the projects progress accordingly. We've got complementarity across and technological, organisational and institutional dimensions. So we're coming back to this notion of these different dimensions of scaling, for example, and the need for those sort of cross-scale interactions as part of the co-innovation approach. And then we've got co-innovation or coordination at multiple levels across the value chain and between participants. So we've got those three, that triple co of collaboration, complementarity and coordination. And in the slide that follows, just trying to put that into a little bit more of a representation of what that might mean in practice. So in terms of collaboration, we're looking at sort of multi-actor dynamics as part of that, and those participants might be drawn from the public sector, for example, from research institutes, from the private sector, from NGOs, from farmers and growers, or from a wider community or group. And it's interesting to reflect, how they are represented and what contribution they're making, what perspective of the problem they bring to the discussion, and what learnings are developing and emerging from those discussions between those diverse actors. Then we've got the complementarity in terms of that multi-dimensional change in a technological and network and an institutional level. And those are aspects that we'll come back to in a slide or two's time when we start talking about anchoring and how we're thinking in terms of technological, network and institutional anchoring almost as a proxy for scaling activities. And trying to understand as well the sort of the coordination across those different levels of engagement, through from sort of the field level engagement to the global sort of drivers or pressures for change, which we outlined in the earlier slides. And really trying to make the connection there that sort of it's this where the sort of the bottom up meets the top down. That's where we're starting to see sort of traction for co-innovation activities, and it's trying to give a voice to all of those practitioners to avoid those potential knowledge gaps which were identified in one of the earlier slides. So I do want to introduce the concept of the multi-level perspective at this point. Don't want to spend too much time on this, and it's probably something that a number of you will already be familiar with, but if we're trying to sort of grapple with this idea of sort of top-down pressure, we've outlined that already from the sort of the landscape perspective in terms of the increasing population, changing dynamics, changing demand for food, climate change, and so on and so forth. And then at the regime or the meso level, we've got those competing paradigms, the agro-industrial, the agri-ecological paradigm. And I think if we see the literature around that, we sort of there's it's suggested that the agro-industrial paradigm, is making some change in response to pressure from agri-ecological pressure that's being exerted. So it is shifting, it's developing itself, but is it changing sufficiently to satisfy those who are pushing for a much harder agroecological perspective? So changes at the regime level. And at the niche level, this is where the local innovations are bubbling to the surface, if you like. There's this sort of those that fit with the prevailing strategy, fit and conform, for example, and those that are much more challenging in stretching and transforming the existing paradigm. So, for example, we might see innovations coming through that support that sort of prevailing agro-industrial, productivist perspective. Others, which would be much more supportive of an agro-ecological perspective, would be sort of termed in terms of stretching and transforming the thinking. So the multi-level perspective is a useful model in terms of trying to bring together some of these very diverse forces impacting on the agri-food sector, and that sort of background that we're working against and trying to understand how some of these co-innovation processes impact on scaling up and scaling out. So as I suggested, I wanted to introduce at this point the theory of anchoring, which we're using as a means of trying to understand these dynamics between niche and regime in particular. And it has two roles really, on a diagnostic tool and also as a much more prescriptive tool, trying to identify shortcomings or challenges facing the development of an innovation and trying to highlight where effort might be required to drive that connection between niche and regime in what we might think of in terms of scaling. So when we're thinking about technological anchoring, we're thinking in terms of ownership of the technical characteristics by the wider body of stakeholders and actors within that particular community. We've got network development in terms of the evolution of that network of actors or participants over time, and as I've said, how that evolves, how some fall by the wayside, new participants come into the equation, and how that is dynamic and evolving over time. Then we've got institutional anchoring, where that's trying to sort of tease out some of these sort of interpretive, normative and economic activities around institutional anchoring. So with respect to sort of how are views of the world changing, how are the rules of the game shifting in favour of the emerging innovation, and is that translating into hard contracts and governance that we might be familiar with in everyday activities. And then on the other hand, we've got the prescriptive components of the theory of anchoring. So, is it communicating an inspiring vision for change? Is it developing, a sustainable and a sustaining network that will support that ambition for change? Is sufficient space for experimentation being created and sustained as part of that? Is it stimulating uptake of partial innovations, for example? So there can be some hesitancy to sort of, we talked about learning by scaling, putting the innovation out into the market, if you like, and exploring how it's received or what the challenges and the barriers might be. So it's a degree of courage and accepting that risk, a bit of trial and error as part of the process. Perhaps creating an exemplar, and we'll see in some of the examples that I'm drawing on in the slides that follow from the justified irrigation work in the WIMAC project, how they went to great pains to try and draw a good cross-section of farmers within the pilot work, so that others in the wider group of farmers could identify situations that really sort of were recognisable to them from their farming circumstances. So here we are using the theory of anchoring in terms of technological network and institutional components, trying to understand those interactions, particularly between niche and regime level, and using that really as sort of an equivalent, if you like, to sort of scaling activities to try and give us some way of investigating those, or some structure to guide those particular investigations. So on the slides that follow, I'll just draw briefly, highlight some of the emerging findings from the justified irrigation work in the WIMAC zone. So I wanted to highlight the sort of technological aspects that I was talking about on the previous slide. So in particular, the system developments, which have really sort of enabled the technology to be rolled out at farm level. So you can think about the remote, or the ability to collect diffuse data remotely, the subsequent processing and the capacity to deliver that back to farm, tailored to their particular circumstances. And the advances as well in farm level control of irrigation that allow those producers to act on the information that they're being provided with. So we're seeing sort of wider system developments that are really sort of enabling the uptake of the justified irrigation approach itself. We've got proof of principle being demonstrated. So MS and his team committed to ensuring timely delivery of accurate briefings on a daily basis to their participants, and they've put great emphasis on that, and I think they've earned a considerable amount of respect from participants in being able to do that throughout the season. But beyond that as well, so it's sort of, I think initially they thought it would just be providing information during the irrigation season, but in fact there was a much wider demand, and participants were starting to use the information not just to inform irrigation decision making, but also a wider farm level decision or management decisions. So in terms of sort of grass management and crop management, for example. So it's something that's become integrated within the wider farming activities. And those are all aspects where we would be identifying elements of technological anchoring, where the participants are starting to take ownership of the technology and it's becoming embedded in their farming practices. So I hope by giving this sort of example, I'm starting to bring to life the concept of anchoring that I was describing in the earlier slide. So when we're talking about network anchoring, I talked about the sort of the emphasis that was put in terms of getting a good cross-section of farm types in terms of dairy and cropping, for example, a range of irrigation infrastructures from centre pivot to these sort of less sophisticated systems, and a good spread of producers or participants across the zone itself to reflect local soil and climatic conditions. And you'll remember from one of the earlier slides that we talked about that sort of specificity of place and how important that was in terms of innovations in the agri-food sector. And what we've seen, or what's been observed in this particular case, is the sort of the organic expansion of the network as participants have shared the farm weather briefing within their sort of communities and groups more widely. So it's something that's expanded. Again, the sort of participants have taken ownership of the technology. In terms of knowledge sharing and the importance of learning within the process, the annual review meetings have been a very important forum in terms of bringing together that project team and the wider body of stakeholders, both to consider the season that's just finished and to plan for the season ahead. And it's sort of the ability to embed that planning for the season ahead in the next season's activities, which really sees those sort of learnings being embedded within the project. But there's also evidence of spontaneous developments being suggested by the stakeholders themselves. So they're sort of, again, taking ownership of the process, you know, sticking their hands up, putting forward ideas, coming forward with suggestions where they would like to see development of the project further down the line. And we've also seen examples of the MB funded follow-up in this particular study, and the ambition to sort of roll the project out beyond the sort of the existing WIMAX zone into the neighbouring zones, for example. So all of those instances we would be looking at in terms of network anchoring. So we're seeing that innovation really starting to gain a foothold amongst that wider community and being sort of, you know, gaining acceptance amongst that particular group. And the third of these criteria in terms of institutional anchoring, we're starting to think here in terms of the challenge of tackling or changing the prevailing mindset. So we've got a sort of what's sometimes called a just-in-case logic. Bearing in mind that the WIMAC is a run-of-the-river scheme, then it's understandable that people want to draw water when it's available. And it's quite a shift in thinking to encourage people to take perhaps a more proactive approach to irrigating when soil and climatic conditions are at their optimum. So something of a challenge to be overcome there in terms of the sort of prevailing institutional logics and this sort of the convincing people of the sort of the reliability of the alternative that you're offering them. At the same time, I think it's the sort of the implementation of the farm environment plans and that emphasis on audited self-management that sort of really acted as a trigger for sort of engagement with the process to an extent. So it's timing. So it's a sort of the justified irrigation has come through at a time when the sort of farm environment plans have very much come to the fore, and they have a role to support that process. And as part of that, you know, they're gaining some traction with stakeholders and with farmers and with decision makers within the sort of the wider body of stakeholders. But underlying all of this, and something that comes through loud and clear from the stakeholder meetings, is the importance of the economic case, of course, in demonstrating value. And we saw that in one of the slides talking about the importance of demonstrating the efficiency of the innovation. So while there's anecdotal evidence coming forward from participants that cost benefits are being realised. I think part of the follow-on is going to explore that in a slightly more formalised approach to try and collect and draw together some of that information to provide a more concrete basis for that discussion to take place. So what I've tried to demonstrate there are aspects of institutional anchoring, network anchoring and technological anchoring as we're starting to see them emerging from the justified irrigation project in the WIMAX zone. So really drawing the discussion to a close, it's trying to think about what the next steps are in terms of understanding not just the dynamics of those particular cases, the ones that I've looked at in a bit more detail, the justified irrigation and the heifer rearing in the context of the primary innovation activities, but also the Stream 3 activities, trying to embed co-innovation within the wider innovation system of New Zealand. I think it's very exciting trying to understand, what the dynamics are between the cases or the project level work and that sort of wider system level activity. And I saw in the recent papers that James circulated from the Outlook in Agriculture, how there's very much this sort of continuing emphasis on trying to understand, the interactions between co-innovation and scaling. And it's really by sort of continuing to investigate these activities, the dynamics between them, that we're hoping to contribute to that particular discussion. I should perhaps mention as well, it's sort of very much hoping it might be possible to get back out to New Zealand later in the year and just to take soundings and to take stock of people's changing perspectives over time. So we've tried to understand what people's or participants' understanding of co-innovation was, but my impression certainly is that sort of has developed and moved in the meantime, and positions have perhaps softened to some extent in terms of sort of a willingness to embrace co-innovation, and understandings have deepened and so forth, and trying to understand some of those dynamics I think will be important in trying to piece together some of these pieces of the puzzle effectively. So hopefully that's given you a flavour for the work that's been going on, some of the emerging findings. I'm really keen to share these findings as they start to take more shape in due course, but hopefully that gives you a flavour of things in the meantime, and I'd be very pleased to answer any further questions that you might have.
Great, thanks Sam. It's really great to see those insights coming from the justified irrigation case study around the technological network and institutional anchoring. We've got a few questions here, and I'll encourage others to put in a few questions as well. So Graham's asking around the language of scaling and transfer seem to imply the transmission of something, and then a lot of the comments seems to be to frame this as transmission of the substance of the innovation itself. What's the role of enabling processes and concepts being transmitted?
Yes, yeah, that's a good point, Graham. Absolutely. So it's sort of, yes. So it's sort of, I think scaling applies, to processes, to products, to services. So it's. I'm sorry if I've given the impression that we're just, thinking in terms of sort of transferring product technologies, for example. That's not the intention. So it's sort of, we're thinking of scaling in much broader terms, in terms of sort of scaling up and out of products, processes, services, whatever the particular innovation might be. And of course, that sort of process aspect, becomes very important when we're thinking about trying to embed the co-innovation approach within that wider New Zealand innovation system and the dynamics of that.
Okay, thanks. That's great, Sam. Then we've got a question from Niels. Does anchoring help to explain issues experienced with scaling, and how?
Yes, Niels, I'm sorry, I probably didn't describe that very effectively. So we're really arguing that progression from niche to regime, if you like, that we demonstrated on one of the earlier slides, which is reflected by anchoring and those interactions between niche and regime, really equates to scaling. And it's a very delicate balance that we're trying to strike with all of that, because we're nervous of trying to oversell the case for sort of applying the multi-level perspective to the investigations that we're undertaking, because we're not claiming that sort of we're looking for transitions in the true sense in the work that we're doing. So we're looking for sort of system innovations and changes within an innovation system, but we're not claiming to be sort of exploring transitions as such. So it's a very fine balance to be struck in terms of how we apply the language of the multi-level perspective within that. Having said all of that, anchoring and the theory of anchoring has been very effectively applied in the study of sort of project and process innovations in the ground. So we've got some examples from France, for instance, where they've used it to explore uptake of agri-environment schemes in the field, and using that language of anchoring to understand those interactions, those complex interactions between participants, and really using the theory of anchoring and as well as sort of the wider concept of the multi-level perspective to really guide those investigations and provide some background structure without allowing them to dominate the analysis to too great an extent.
Okay, we've got a few more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So I do encourage those with other questions to send them through to you, Sam. Is that okay?
I'd be delighted. Yes, please. And I'm sorry I overran slightly, so I didn't leave quite enough time for questions at the end there.
Well, there's definitely some great questions, real interest in your presentation, and it's nicely summed up from Ina, who says, an outstanding presentation. This really provokes the thinking about the what next question. So thank you very much, Sam. Appreciate you being up in the early morning hours in Scotland to present to us, so that we can be enjoying the webinar over our lunch here in New Zealand and Australia. So we look forward to seeing further findings from your research, and really encouraging to hear that you're thinking about coming back out to New Zealand, because we'd love to see you out here. So thank you everybody for attending, and thank you very much, Sam, for your excellent presentation. Bye everybody.
Thanks, James.